June 6, 1944. 6:30 in the morning. Major General Max Pemsel stood in the operations room at 7th Army Headquarters in Le Mans, staring at a map of Normandy as red markers multiplied across the coastline. Paratroopers had been dropping since after midnight. Now landing craft were hitting the beaches. The invasion everyone had prepared for, argued about, and feared was finally happening. And Adolf Hitler was asleep. Pemsel picked up the telephone to call Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters in Paris. His hand was steady, but his voice carried an edge when the connection went through. "The invasion has begun," he said. "We need the Panzer reserves released immediately." The officer on the other end went quiet. Then, "That requires the Führer's authorization." "Then wake him." Another pause. "No one is authorized to wake the Führer." Pemsel set the phone down. Through the windows, dawn light was spreading across France. Somewhere out there, Allied soldiers were wading through surf and climbing cliffs, while German defenders fired everything they had. The outcome of the war might be decided in the next few hours. And the only man who could release the armored divisions needed to stop them was asleep at his mountain retreat in Bavaria, 900 kilometers away, with standing orders that he was not to be disturbed. The irony was that Hitler had been warned, multiple times, by multiple people. He had simply refused to believe them. 3 months earlier, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had stood in this same operations room, studying the same maps. He had spent weeks inspecting the Atlantic Wall, walking beaches, examining defenses, and talking to the men who would have to hold them. His conclusion had been stark, and he had stated it clearly to anyone who would listen. The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll have just one chance to stop the invasion in the first 24 hours. After that, Allied air power and naval guns will make it impossible to move reinforcements. Everything depends on having strong forces right at the coast, ready to counterattack immediately. He had wanted the Panzer divisions positioned close to the likely landing sites, spread along the coast where they could reach any beach within an hour. Hitler had refused. The Führer was convinced the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. He had kept the strongest panzer formations in reserve there, under his personal control. No one could move them without his direct authorization. Rommel had argued. He had prepared reports. He had requested meetings. In April, he had driven to Berchtesgaden to make his case in person. Hitler had listened politely, then dismissed his concerns. "The enemy will come at Calais," the Führer had said. "Everything else is deception. I know how the English think." The intelligence services had provided warnings too. Throughout May, reconnaissance flights reported massive Allied buildup in southern England. Ports were packed with landing craft. Airfields were crowded with bombers and fighters. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had intercepted communications suggesting an operation was imminent. Some reports specifically mentioned Normandy. Hitler had waved them away. He had become obsessed with a deception operation he had partially seen through. The Allies were running an elaborate scheme called Fortitude, using fake radio traffic and dummy equipment to suggest a massive army group was forming in southeastern England aimed at Calais. Hitler had detected the deception, which made him certain he was right. "They want us to think they're coming to Calais," he had told his staff, "which means they're definitely coming to Calais. They think I'm a fool." The logic was circular and absolute. No amount of evidence could penetrate it. On June 5th, the weather had turned. Storms rolled across the channel, waves built to heights that would swamp landing craft. Wind and rain reduced visibility to almost nothing. Rommel had checked the forecast, seen that the bad weather would continue for days, and decided the Allies couldn't possibly invade during such conditions. He had left for Germany to visit his wife Lucie for her birthday on June 6th and to make one more attempt to convince Hitler to release the panzers. That evening at Berghof, Hitler had stayed up past 3 in the morning, as he usually did, talking with staff about architecture and Wagner and his theories about Churchill's psychology. He had gone to bed confident that nothing would happen for at least a week. The weather made invasion impossible. He had left orders that he was not to be disturbed before noon. At 4 in the morning, the phone had started ringing at 7th Army headquarters. Reports came in of paratroopers landing inland from the Normandy coast. Hundreds of them, then thousands. American, British, Canadian. They were seizing bridges, blocking roads, creating chaos behind the coastal defenses. At first, the duty officers had thought it was a diversion. A raid, maybe. Something to draw attention from the real invasion at Calais. But the reports kept coming. More paratroopers. Gliders landing, entire battalions dropping from the sky. By 6 in the morning, the naval bombardment had begun. Battleships and cruisers pounding the coast with shells the size of automobiles, the sound carried for kilometers. Then the landing craft appeared through the morning haze, waves of them heading for 5 separate beaches. Pemsel had called Paris immediately. He had reached General Blumentritt, Rundstedt's chief of staff. "This is the invasion," Pemsel had said. "Not a feint, the real thing. We need armor now." Blumentritt had understood instantly. He had woken Rundstedt, who had taken one look at the reports and made his decision. "Release the panzers," he had ordered. 12th SS and Panzer Lehr. Get them moving to the coast. But the panzers were in Hitler's reserve. Rundstedt didn't have authority to move them. That authority rested with the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the armed forces' high command, which meant it rested with Hitler. Blumentritt had called OKW headquarters. He had reached General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations staff. Jodl was at Berghof with the Führer. Blumentritt had explained the situation. "Field Marshal von Rundstedt requests immediate release of the panzer reserves," he had said. "The invasion is underway in Normandy." Jodl's response had been careful. "I need to verify this with the Führer. The Führer is asleep. Then we wait until he wakes. General, Allied forces are landing on the beaches right now. Every hour we delay." "I cannot authorize movement of the Führer's reserves without his approval," Jodl had said, "and I cannot wake the Führer. He left explicit orders." Blumentritt had tried to explain the urgency. The Allies were establishing a beachhead. They were bringing tanks and artillery ashore. German defenders were fighting hard, but they were infantry, unsupported, facing naval guns and air strikes. The only way to throw the invasion back into the sea was to hit it with armor before it consolidated. Every minute mattered. Jodl had remained unmoved. "When the Führer wakes, I will present the situation to him. Until then, the panzers stay where they are." The call had ended. Blumentritt had turned to Rundstedt and delivered the news. The field marshal, who had commanded armies since before Hitler came to power, who had led the invasion of Poland and France, who had seen every kind of military crisis, had stood silent for a moment. Then he had said, very quietly, "This is madness." At 7th Army headquarters, Pemsel had received the news and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had looked at the map again. The red markers were spreading. Reports were coming in of Allied troops pushing inland. German strong points were being overrun or bypassed. The 47th Panzer Corps, the only armored unit in the immediate area, was trying to respond, but it was scattered and under constant air attack. Its tanks were moving individually or in small groups, getting picked off by Allied fighter bombers the moment they appeared on the roads. The larger panzer divisions, the ones that could make a difference, were sitting idle. 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was near Lisieux, 120 kilometers from the beaches. Panzer Lehr was even farther south. Both divisions were fresh, fully equipped, ready to fight. Their commanders were waiting for orders. Their tank crews were sitting in their vehicles, engines cold, watching the sky fill with Allied aircraft, and knowing that somewhere to the north, the invasion they had trained to stop was happening without them. At 8 in the morning, Rommel had received a phone call at his home in Herrlingen. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was on the line from headquarters in La Roche-Guyon. "The invasion has begun," Speidel had said. "Normandy, multiple beaches." Rommel had been silent for several seconds. Then, "I knew it would come there." He had left immediately for France, knowing he was already too late. The 5-hour drive ahead of him was 5 hours the Allies would use to dig in. 5 hours his troops would fight without his leadership. 5 hours the panzers would sit motionless, waiting for authorization from a man who was asleep. At Berghof, Hitler's staff had been gathering in the hall since dawn, whispering. The reports from France were being received and logged, but no one was taking them to the Führer's quarters. His standing orders were absolute. He had raged at staff before for waking him unnecessarily. The consequences of disturbing his sleep were immediate and personal. The consequences of the invasion were distant and abstract. So they waited. Major General Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant, stood outside the Führer's bedroom door at 9:30, holding a folder of reports. He had been there for 20 minutes, listening to the silence from inside, trying to decide if the situation was urgent enough to justify knocking. Behind him, other officers were gathering, their faces tight with stress. Everyone knew what was happening in France. Everyone knew the panzers were sitting idle. No one wanted to be the person who woke Hitler. At 10 o'clock, sounds of movement came from inside the bedroom. Schmundt straightened, gripping the folder. The door opened. Hitler emerged, already talking about the previous night's conversation, asking if anyone had found the book on Roman architecture he had mentioned. He was halfway down the hall before Schmundt managed to interrupt. "Mein Führer, there are urgent reports from France." Hitler stopped. He turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to attention. "What reports?" "The Allies have landed. In Normandy. Paratroopers overnight. Amphibious landings this morning. Multiple beaches. Field Marshal von Rundstedt requests immediate release of the panzer reserves." Hitler took the folder. He opened it and began reading, his face showing nothing. The hall went quiet. Officers watched him process the information, waiting for his response, knowing that men were dying while he read. After several minutes, Hitler looked up. "This is a feint," he said. "A diversion. The real invasion will come at Calais." Schmundt hesitated. "Mein Führer, the reports indicate this is a major operation. 5 landing beaches, thousands of ships, airborne divisions." "I don't care what the reports indicate," Hitler said. "I know how the enemy thinks. This is exactly what they want us to believe. They want us to commit our reserves to Normandy so we'll be weak when the real invasion comes. I will not fall for it." He handed the folder back. "The panzers stay where they are. When the main invasion begins at Calais, we'll need them." Jodl, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward. "Mein Führer, Field Marshal von Rundstedt believes—" "Rundstedt is being deceived," Hitler said, "just as they intend. Tell him the reserves remain under my control. If this Normandy operation grows into something significant, we can address it then. For now, we watch and wait." He turned and walked toward the dining room, already moving on to other topics, leaving his staff standing in the hallway with the reports from France in their hands. At OKW headquarters, Jodl made the call to Paris. He reached Blumentritt and delivered the decision. "The Führer believes Normandy is a diversion. The panzer reserves will not be released at this time." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Blumentritt said, "General, I must stress the seriousness of the situation. This is not a diversion. The Allies are ashore in strength. Without armor, we cannot drive them back." "I understand your position," Jodl said. "But the Führer's assessment is that the main invasion will come at Calais. He will not commit the reserves based on what may be a deception." "This is not a deception," Blumentritt said, his voice rising slightly. "We have visual confirmation of thousands of ships, thousands of aircraft, entire divisions landing. This is the invasion." "Present your case to the Führer directly if you wish," Jodl said. "But I cannot override his decision." The call ended. Blumentritt stood with the phone in his hand, staring at nothing. Around him, the operations room was full of activity. Staff officers were updating maps, taking reports, coordinating responses. Everyone was working frantically to manage a crisis that required resources they didn't have and couldn't get. Rundstedt entered the room. He looked at Blumentritt's face and understood immediately. He refused. He believes it's a diversion. Rundstedt walked to the map. He studied the red markers spreading across Normandy. He looked at the positions of the panzer divisions, sitting idle while the battle was being lost. He had commanded armies for decades. He had won victories across Europe. He knew what was possible and what wasn't, and he knew with absolute certainty that without armor, the invasion could not be stopped. "Get me the Führer on the phone," he said. The call was placed. It went through to Berghof. Hitler came on the line. Rundstedt made his case clearly and professionally. The Allies were ashore in strength. The landings were not a feint. German infantry was fighting hard, but being overwhelmed. Naval gunfire was destroying defensive positions. Allied air power was preventing daylight movement. The only chance to throw the invasion back was to hit it with concentrated armor in the next few hours before the beachhead was consolidated. Hitler listened. Then he repeated his assessment. Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion would come at Calais. The panzers would stay in, reserve. Rundstedt tried again. He explained the intelligence, the scale of the operation, the strategic implications. He pointed out that even if Calais was the eventual target, stopping the Normandy landing was essential. Allowing the Allies to establish a foothold in France would be catastrophic, regardless of where the main invasion came. Hitler's voice grew harder. "I have made my decision. The reserves will not be committed to what is obviously a deception operation. That is final." The call ended. Rundstedt stood holding the dead phone. Around him his staff had gone quiet, watching him. The field marshal, who had maintained professional composure through every crisis of the war, who had never shown emotion in front of subordinates, slowly set the phone down. His face had gone pale. "He believes we're being deceived," Rundstedt said. "He will not release the panzers." The room stayed silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Without the panzer divisions, there was no mobile reserve. Without mobile reserve, there was no way to counterattack. Without counterattack, the invasion could not be stopped. The battle was being lost by decision from 900 kilometers away. Blumentritt spoke carefully. "What are your orders, Herr Feldmarschall?" Rundstedt looked at the map again, at the red markers, at the blue markers showing German units, scattered and unsupported, at the panzer divisions sitting uselessly in reserve. He had spent his entire career following orders. He had commanded armies under the Kaiser and under Hitler. He had won and lost battles. He had never disobeyed a direct order from a superior. "Continue defensive operations with available forces," he said. "Request immediate air support, though I doubt we'll get it. Prepare contingency plans for withdrawal if the beachhead cannot be contained." He paused. "And keep requesting the panzers, every hour, until he changes his mind or the battle is over." At 12th SS Panzer Division headquarters near Lisieux, SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt was pacing. His division was one of the finest in the German army. 12,000 men, over 150 tanks, fully equipped, fully trained, ready for combat. The soldiers were young, most in their late teens or early 20s, veterans of the Hitler Youth who had volunteered for the Waffen-SS. They were fanatics, true believers, exactly the kind of troops needed for the desperate counterattack that could throw the Allies back into the sea. And they were sitting idle. Witt had been receiving reports since dawn. He knew the invasion was happening. He knew where. He knew his division could reach the beaches in 3 to 4 hours if they moved immediately. His tank commanders were ready. His infantry was mounted in half-tracks. His artillery was limbered and prepared to move. Everything was in place except the order that required Hitler's authorization. At 11 in the morning, Witt received a call from Corps headquarters. Still no authorization. Continue to stand by. He slammed the phone down hard enough to crack the handset. His operations officer, standing nearby, spoke quietly. Sir, the men are asking when we move. Tell them we're waiting for orders from the Führer. They know the invasion is happening. They can hear the aircraft. They want to fight. Witt turned to look at him. So do I. But we don't move without authorization. Those are the rules. The Führer controls the reserves. We wait for the Führer. At Panzer Division headquarters, farther south, General Fritz Bayerlein was having the same conversation with his staff. His division was even stronger than 12th SS. Over 180 tanks, 2 complete panzer regiments, the best equipment in the German army. And like Witt, he was waiting for a phone call that wasn't coming. Bayerlein had fought in North Africa under Rommel. He knew what Allied air power could do. He knew that if his division tried to move during daylight without authorization, without air cover, without coordination with other units, it would be torn apart by fighter bombers before it reached the coast. But he also knew that if they waited much longer, it wouldn't matter. The Allies would be too strong to dislodge. The phone rang at noon. Bayerlein grabbed it. Corps headquarters. Still no authorization. He hung up without responding. One of his staff officers spoke. General, if we don't move soon... I know, Bayerlein said. Believe me, I know. At Berghof, Hitler was having lunch. He was discussing the design of the new opera house planned for Linz. He was in good spirits, confident that he had seen through the Allied deception, pleased with his own strategic insight. Around him, his staff ate quietly, saying little, thinking about Normandy. In Normandy, the battle was spreading. Allied troops were pushing inland from all 5 beaches. Omaha Beach had been a bloodbath, but the Americans were off the sand and climbing the bluffs. Utah Beach had gone more smoothly. The British and Canadians were consolidating their positions, bringing tanks and artillery ashore, preparing to push toward Caen. German defenders were fighting hard. Individual units were holding out, inflicting casualties, making the Allies pay for every meter. But they were being overwhelmed by numbers and firepower. Strong points that should have held for days were falling in hours. Defensive lines that should have stopped the advance were being bypassed or blasted apart, and the panzers sat idle. At 2 in the afternoon, Rommel arrived at his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon. He had driven through the chaos of an invasion in progress, seeing Allied aircraft everywhere, hearing the sounds of battle from the coast, passing columns of refugees fleeing inland. He walked into the operations room and went straight to the map. Speidel briefed him. 5 beaches, all landings successful, Allied forces pushing inland. German. Counterattacks piecemeal and ineffective. Panzer reserve still not released. Rommel stood silent, staring at the map. Everyone in the room watched him, waiting for orders, waiting for the field marshal who had stopped the British in Africa to pull off another miracle. Finally, Rommel spoke. "Get me Rundstedt." The call was placed. Rundstedt came on the line. Rommel didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What's the status of the panzers?" "Still in reserve. The Führer believes Normandy is a diversion." Rommel closed his eyes briefly. "It's not a diversion." "I know. I've told him. He won't listen. Then we need to go over his head. We need to..." Rommel stopped. There was no one over Hitler's head. Hitler was the supreme commander. His word was absolute. "How long until he changes his mind?" "I don't know." Rundstedt said, "I'm requesting release every hour. Jodl keeps saying he's presenting the case, but so far, nothing." Rommel looked at the map again, at the red markers spreading like a stain across the coast. By the time he releases them, it will be too late. "I know." The call ended. Rommel turned to his staff. Continue defensive operations, commit everything we have locally, and pray that the Führer wakes up to reality before we lose France. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler finally changed his mind. Not because of the reports from France, not because of the pleas from Rundstedt and Rommel, but because the situation had become undeniable even at Berghof. The reports were too consistent, the scale too large, the Allied commitment too obvious. Jodl had presented the case one more time, laying out the evidence carefully, and Hitler had finally nodded. Very well. Release 12th SS and Panzer Lehr, but I want them to attack immediately upon arrival. No delays. We throw the enemy back into the sea before they can consolidate. The order went out at 4 in the afternoon. 10 hours after the first landing craft hit the beaches. 10 hours during which the Allies had brought ashore thousands of tons of supplies, dozens of tanks, hundreds of artillery pieces. 10 hours during which they had pushed inland, seized key terrain, and begun building a logistical infrastructure that would support the entire campaign. At 12th SS headquarters, Witt received the order and felt a surge of relief and rage mixed together. Relief that they were finally moving, rage that they were 10 hours late. He issued orders immediately. The division began to move, and immediately the problems began. Allied air reconnaissance spotted the movement within minutes. Fighter bombers appeared overhead within the hour. The roads became killing zones. Tanks had to scatter into fields and woods. Movement that should have taken 3 hours stretched to 6, then 8, then 12. Units arrived piecemeal, disorganized, having lost vehicles and men to air attack the entire way. Panzer Lehr had it worse. Moving from farther south, in broad daylight, under clear skies, Bayerling's division was savaged. Fighter bombers hit them in waves, typhoons with rockets, thunderbolts with bombs, Mustangs with cannon. The division lost over 100 vehicles in the first day of movement, before it even reached the battlefield. By the time the panzers arrived in strength, it was June 7th. The Allies had been ashore for 24 hours. The beachhead was consolidated. Naval guns controlled the approaches. Allied fighters owned the sky. The counterattack Rommel had wanted to launch in the first hours, when the invasion was most vulnerable, was now being thrown against a prepared enemy with overwhelming fire support. The attacks failed, not because the German soldiers didn't fight. They fought with desperate courage. 12th SS Panzer threw itself at the Canadian positions near Caen with fanatical intensity. Panzer Lehr hit the Americans near Omaha Beach in a series of armored assaults that came close to breaking through. Individual battles were won, local successes were achieved, but the beachhead held. The Allies were ashore to stay. At OKW headquarters, when the reports came in of the failed counterattacks, of the losses to air attack during movement, of the missed opportunity, Jodl prepared a summary for Hitler. He documented the timeline carefully. The initial request for panzer release at 6 in the morning. The repeated requests throughout the morning. The final authorization at 4 in the afternoon. The results. He did not include his personal assessment. He did not note that the 10-hour delay had likely cost Germany the battle. He simply presented the facts. Hitler read the report and said nothing. He moved on to other matters. The decision had been made. The outcome had been determined. There was no value in discussing it further. But among the field commanders, the discussion was intense. Rundstedt, Rommel, their staff officers, the Panzer Division commanders, everyone who had watched the battle unfold, everyone who had seen the opportunity slip away, they all knew exactly what had happened. Blumentritt recorded it in his diary. The Führer's refusal to release the Panzer reserves on the morning of June 6th cost us the battle for France. By the time authorization came, the moment had passed. We threw brave men against a consolidated enemy and accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty lists. Rommel wrote to his wife, "The invasion could have been stopped, should have been stopped, but the decision came too late. Now we fight a defensive campaign we cannot win." Even Rundstedt, normally careful in his words, spoke bluntly to his staff. We had one chance, one day, one moment when we could have thrown them back, and we wasted it waiting for a phone call from Bavaria. The soldiers in the panzer divisions felt it most acutely. They had sat idle, ready to fight, while the invasion happened without them. They had moved when ordered and been torn apart by air attack. They had attacked when they finally reached the battlefield and been stopped by an enemy that had used the delay to prepare. They had done everything asked of them, and it hadn't mattered. SS Sturmann Heinrich Becker, a tank gunner in 12th SS Panzer, wrote in a letter home, "We could hear the battle from where we waited. We could see the aircraft overhead. We knew what was happening, and we sat there, doing nothing, because someone 900 kilometers away didn't believe the reports. By the time we moved, it was too late. We fought as hard as we could, but you can't make up for 10 hours of lost time. Not in war. Not when everything depends on speed." The letter was found in his effects after he was killed 3 days later, during another failed counterattack near Caen. The strategic implications took longer to become clear, but they were inexorable. With the Normandy beachhead secure, the Allies began building up forces for the breakout. More divisions landed, more supplies came ashore. The logistical base that would support the drive across France was established in those first critical days, while the German panzers were sitting idle or dying on the roads. By the end of June, the Allies had landed over 850,000 men, 150,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies through the Normandy beaches. The German army in France was locked into a defensive battle it couldn't win, trying to contain an enemy that grew stronger every day. Rommel tried everything. He reorganized defenses, he shifted units, he launched counterattacks, he requested reinforcements. But the fundamental problem remained. The Allies were ashore in strength, and they weren't leaving. The one chance to stop them had been on June 6th, in the first hours, before they consolidated. That chance had been lost. On July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighters. He was severely wounded, his skull fractured, and had to be evacuated to Germany. He would never return to France. Before he left, he dictated a final assessment to Speidel. "The war in the West is lost. It was lost on June 6th when we failed to throw the enemy back into the sea in the first 24 hours. Everything since has been a delaying action." Rundstedt lasted slightly longer. On July 1st, during another argument with Hitler about strategy, he was asked what should be done about the situation in France. His response was blunt. "Make peace, you fools." He was relieved of command the next day. The officers who had stood in the operations rooms on June 6th, watching the invasion unfold, requesting the panzers, waiting for authorization that came too late, they continued fighting. They followed orders. They did their duty. But they all knew the truth. The battle for Normandy had been lost before it began. Not because German soldiers didn't fight hard enough. Not because the defenses were inadequate. Not because Rommel's strategy was wrong. But because the one man who could authorize the response that might have made a difference had been asleep, and when he finally woke, he didn't believe what he was being told. 10 hours. That's what the delay came down to. 10 hours between when the panzers were requested and when they were released. 10 hours during which the Allies established the beachhead that became the base for the liberation of Europe. Later, historians would debate whether releasing the panzers earlier would have actually stopped the invasion. The Allies had overwhelming advantages in air power, naval gunfire, and logistics. The German response might have failed regardless. But the German commanders who were there, who fought the battle, who saw what happened, they had no doubt. Blumentritt wrote in his post-war memoir, "We will never know if an immediate counterattack would have succeeded, but we know with certainty that the delayed counterattack failed. The question that haunts me is simple. What if someone had woken Hitler at 7 in the morning instead of 10? What if the authorization had come at 8 instead of 4 in the afternoon? Would those hours have made a difference? I believe they would have. I believe we lost France in those hours, but I cannot prove it because the decision was made and history proceeded accordingly. That's what the German High Command said when they found out Hitler had ignored the intelligence and delayed the response to D-Day. They said it was madness. They said it was a catastrophe. They said it cost them the battle and ultimately the war. But they said it quietly, among themselves, in operations rooms and staff meetings and private letters. Because the man who made the decision was the Führer, and the Führer's decisions were not questioned. Not publicly, not officially, only later, after the war was lost, after Germany was occupied, after Hitler was dead. Did they speak openly about June 6th and the 10 hours that changed everything? By then, it was history. The outcome was fixed. The invasion had succeeded. France had been liberated. Germany had been defeated. And it had all begun with a phone call that wasn't made, an order that wasn't given, and a decision that came too late to matter.